Okay, so first of all, thank you for coming to this lecture. As you can see, the title of my talk is slightly different than the title mentioned in the conference program, but don't worry, I will answer the question, which is in the proper title mentioned in the conference program. And the answer is quite trivial. It is simple fact that cognitive science is sometimes useful for philosophy and sometimes not. So my decision to change the topic of my talk was partially motivated by the fact that I wanted to avoid talking about trivialities. Instead of that, I will try to sketch a general landscape, so to speak, philosophical landscapes, and make several distinctions that might be useful for persons who think and work with concepts in different areas. So most of you would be probably disappointed by my talk because I will be following something that is described here by Bertrand Russell as not necessarily a piece of good philosophy. This is a nice paper by Russell about the title of the paper is The Cult of Common Usage. And here, as you can see, we have a short conversation. Certain person, Russell himself, is asking about the shortest way to Winchester, and there is another person who is trying to, who is asked to provide directions and answer that general question. As you can see, that person is in no way interested in giving the answer. What that person is really interested in here in this exchange is the meaning of the question, right? And Russell in this essay is really critical about this kind of philosophy. I think he's slightly too harsh about it. And I will be really doing something like that. I will not be answering a question, probably what are concepts, because I'm not talking about the way to Winchester, to be strict. I will be really interested in the meaning of the question, what is concept or what are concepts? So I will defend in this talk the thesis that has been formulated many years ago by Frege. This is a very famous quote. And Frege in that quote says that there are various uses of the term concept. And there are two principal uses, one that is called by Frege psychological use, the other that is called logical use, and there are probably more uses that are mixtures or combinations of those two basic uses. And I think that Frege was basically right, and I will therefore defend the thesis that there are at least three different uses of the word concept that can be found in various areas. One philosophical, the other psychological, and the third one logical. And I won't be interested very much in the philosophical meaning of concept. I mostly would like to make a distinction between psychological and logical sense of the word concept. So what are concepts in psychological sense? I will use this concept P as an abbreviation of that term. So here are some quotations, one from Susan Carey, from her book, The Origin of Concepts. So Carey says the concepts in the psychological sense are units of thought, constituents of beliefs, and theories. I'm not very happy about this definition because I think it mixes several different things here. On the other hand, here's the definition given by philosophers, Margolis and Lawrence, from the paper about the ontology of concepts. As you can see here, they define concepts as some mental representations, and they say that they are constituents of propositional attitudes such as beliefs and desires. And as you can see, this definition partially overlaps with the one given by Carey here, right? And what is interesting, another philosopher, much more careful with the use of the word concept, is pointing out that if we contrast philosophy and cognitive science, there are really two different uses of the word concept here. One which corresponds to this psychological view of concept described by Margolis and Lawrence, right? So according to this meaning of the word concept, we are speaking about units or parts of propositional attitudes here, and this is a philosophical sense. On the other hand, we have this cognitive science sense when we are speaking about certain kinds of, as you can see, bodies of knowledge that are used in certain cognitive actions, tasks, and similar things. So there is a small mess about the use of the word concept here, because as you can see, not all authors are making clear distinction. So first of all, the first question when inquiring the meaning of the word concept, mostly now I will interested in this psychological meaning of concept, is a very simple and difficult simultaneously question. Namely, are concepts kinds of observable entities or rather theoretical entities? This is a basic question, and if you take a look at the history of thinking and theories of concept, there was a time, mostly in the 17th century and at the beginning of 18th century, when many persons were thinking that we have a kind of direct access to concepts. They are just some kind of mental images that are present to the mind. Most British empiricists, along with Descartes, for example, they were thinking along that way. But I think that current intellectual landscape is rather different. And I think that we mostly believe now that the concept of concept, or the idea of concept, is a theoretical idea. And I am unable here to give you a full justification of that claim. I can only just point out that a quite obvious thing, that when cognitive scientists and psychologists are using the word concept, they are really introducing a term that somehow describes certain abilities and actions of the agents they are studying, right? So we have various cognitive actions or behaviors, if you prefer, like categorizing, learning, inferring, whatever you want here, right? And concepts are used both to explain those actions and describe them in a certain systematical way. And as such, we might think they are just a kind of abbreviation for those much more longer descriptions that are referring to those cognitive activities as such. And I think this is quite obvious view, but if you think that concepts in psychological sense are not theoretical entities, then you are very welcome to convince me that it is not the case. I will be very happy to hear argument to the contrary. Of course, not all authors are in full agreement with that, because there are certain authors who are using the word concept in a way quite similar to this traditional 17th century way. So this is the first question on our decision tree. And we go to along the theoretical line here. The second question, which is interesting, is related with a distinction made many years ago by Hans Reichenbach and reintroduced to philosophy by Dennett, mostly, between two types of theoretical entities, so-called illata and so-called abstracta. What is the difference between those two types of theoretical entities? The distinction is mostly that illata are inferred entities that cannot be reduced in a smooth and easy way to other entities, mostly the parts of those entities and observational entities. The connection between observation and theoretical entity here is mostly probabilistic in that case, right? In the case of abstracta, the reduction is easy because we can think that abstracta are really a kind of umbrella concepts that are just used for the sake of convenience. So just let me explain you that with a simple example. Imagine that you have just moved to a new city, and after a short stay, you realize that every day at 12 p.m., the series of 12 bell-like sounds occurs, right? You might introduce a concept of something that is responsible for the production of this series of sounds, right? And is used as a part of some social practice here, connected with, of course, here with time measuring somehow. And take that thing to be a bell, right? But what is important here in that simple story is that your notion of the bell responsible for the sounds thus introduced is an illatum in Reichenbach's sense. Because you cannot rule out, for example, the possibility that there are several bells that in several charges that produce this series of sounds, right? So there is a kind of, let's say, probabilistic connection between your notion of a bell responsible for the sounds and several observable entities. On the other hand, if you contrast that with, I don't know, I use here the concept of social group, used in sociology mostly, then if we take the standard definition of that notion that mentions that social groups are classes of two or more people that interact with each other and have a certain sense of identity, common identity, then I think if we take this definition for granted, we can say that the notion of social group is abstractum in Reichenbach sense, because we can replace all claims about social groups with possibly longer claims about people, interactions, and feeling of identity within the group, right? So this is the basic distinction. So now the question is, are concepts illata or abstracta, if they are theoretical entities? And I think that my feeling in general is that they should be think of as abstracta, not as illata, because I think I won't be also able to provide here you the full argument. My feeling in general is that when theorists are using the word concepts in most theories, at least I know, they are really introducing this umbrella concept that simply allows them to describe certain things in a shorter and better, from a pragmatic point of view, way. So really, I think that we can always replace talk about concept with talk about abilities, actions, and cognitive processes, and whatever you would like to take. So I have here two examples that would illustrate why one might think like that. One which refers to this classical, beautiful experiment by Premack and Premack about chimpanzees and the use of and the connection between the capacity to learn complex concepts, abstract concepts, and ability to manipulate certain simple sign languages, right? This is a very beautiful classical result. I don't know, for example, Andy Clark uses as an argument for his claim that language and sign system in a certain way augment our computation, as he formulates that. So there is this beautiful, beautiful description of certain kinds of animal behavior, and I think it must be clear here that instead of, I don't know, speaking about a concept of a half as something gained by or acquired by chimpanzees, we may speak really about, for example, the ability to categorize, right? Which is just a kind of action, maybe disposition of some sort. But we can really, if you would like, to replace one way of speaking by another way of speaking. Other example is connected with the theory of Peter Gardenfors. I know that Professor Gardenfors is here, so he might disagree with that. But I think this theory is also a beautiful example of use of the word concept in a reductive way, in a certain Reichenbachian sense. Namely, in his theory, I won't be describing the theory because yesterday we had a great lecture on that, so I won't be going through all those points. Just let me say briefly that we have this notion of quality dimension, which is a basic notion in this theory. We have notions such as conceptual space and the domain, and we have two types of concepts that are distinguished within this theory. So-called properties, or as I am calling them here, a single domain natural concepts and multiple domain natural concepts. And what is the essence of this theory in its general form is that those two types of concepts are in a certain sense introduced by means of those more basic concepts. So I think that this is at least my interpretation, that if we go along this decision tree, that Peter Gardenfors' theory is probably an example of theory where we are dealing with concepts as abstracta in the Reichenbach sense. But if I am mistaken here, we might just stay with this Premack and Premack example. But I will be very happy to know the opinion of the author of the theory if he's thinking that I'm right. So I think that if we go along this decision tree and we arrive here, then there is another question which I am unable to answer today, namely whether illata, so concepts in this reductive sense, are functional concepts, the concepts which are defined within the theory, or rather natural kind concepts like, I don't know, parrot carrot, or whatever you want to take here as an example of natural kind concept. And I don't know what is the answer to the question. My philosophical attitude to that is that I'm slightly closer to thinking about concepts here in functional manner. But of course you might disagree. I will be happy about to hear the arguments to contrary. What is important in recent philosophical studies about concepts, partially due to Maschery, there is a nice book, Doing Without Concepts, published quite recently. He's defending something that is called heterogeneity thesis, namely that really by using the term concept in psychological sense within cognitive science, we are using it in so different manners that we really should abandon using that concept at all, right? And just speak about prototypes, exemplars, theories, and other notions that might be much more useful. And I think that this Maschery thesis corresponds quite nicely to this functional way of thinking about psychological concept, because here we might also think about the pluralistic and monistic attitude to that, but I will not go into details. So this is something I want to say about psychological concepts, right? I think that we should really take them to be theoretical entities of the type called abstracta and probably functional concepts, right? And this is a general description of the notion of concept that is possibly used in cognitive science, cognitive psychology, and other fields. On the other hand, as was mentioned at the very beginning, Frege was thinking that there is another sense, at least one sense of the word concept in a logical sense. Now a few things about this. I think that the best approach to the concepts in the logical sense is to define them or just to explicate them as a result or products of something I will call prima facie explication, not explanation. That's important. And I'm taking this term explication, of course, from Carnap and the others, but the usage of that concept here is slightly instrumentalistic and pragmatic. So the meaning is slightly changed, but what I like about this original Carnap's idea concerning explications is that there are suggestions in work of Carnap and Quine that explication can be, to some extent, conventional and can really replace the original concept they explicate, right? So I like this idea. So what I think is just we have a basic question. What is F when F is whatever you want? Action, function, hand, planet, mind, whatever, right? And we have certain possible answers to that question. Overt answers that are ostensive, like, I don't know, what is hand? This is hand, right? Something like that. We have also things that I call prima facie explications. So those are really any answers to that question, possibly inadequate. And we might think of them as a secunda facie explications, which are slightly better than the prima facie explications, namely because they are assumed to meet certain additional constraints of precision, adequateness, whatever you want. Really. So when I am defining concepts in logical sense as products or results of prima facie explications, I'm just taking that we should take those certain possible explications, like, I don't know, those explications of the concept of hand. Those are taken from real papers. This is not my invention. So, for example, if you take the second explication, it's taken from this Wierzbicka theory of semantic primes, right? So as you can see, it's quite funny definition about what is hand. So you might take that, and the concept in a logical sense is a result of such explication. And what is called by most philosophers conceptual analysis is really investigation into certain properties of prima facie explications here. Namely, studying logical consequences of those explications, investigating whether those explications met standards that we expect them to be met in certain situations. And of course, the ambiguity question is another question that is important for the task of analyzing concepts in the logical sense or doing conceptual analysis in that sense. In many papers about concepts in this logical sense, it is mentioned that those concepts in logical sense should also meet something that I called Fregean constraints. which I taken originally from several different works of Frege. So there are 4 constraints that might be mentioned here in connection with concept. First of all is that concepts in this logical sense have certain ranges of applications. So this is, of course, the famous Fregean definition that the concept is a function that takes truth value, as that gives truth value as for a certain arguments, right, as its value of a function. Second of all, we believe after Frege possibly that concepts in this logical sense contain certain procedure of determining how the value is calculated, so to speak. In addition to that, it's mentioned quite often that concepts are senses in a Fregean sense, and they are abstract entities. This is quite important for Frege theory. What I would like to say is that in many discussions about this logical sense of concept, too much stress is put on 2 last constraints. I think that those 2 first constraints are really important, and I would say that even essential for the logical meaning of the word concept. And of course, the results of explications, right? In general, they're meeting those 2 first constraints that are mentioned here because they have ranges of application, even if they are very bad, right? They always is something to what they apply or not. And on the other hand, they determine possibly partial procedures of calculating the properties of objects to which the concept is referring in that sense. That might be important for philosophers because there is a quite common and widespread tendency nowadays to criticize conceptual analysis. Many philosophers are writing papers against conceptual analysis. I think that they are mostly misdescribing what is really conceptual analysis because they put too much stress on intuitions, a priori, and other things. I think that the proper picture of conceptual analysis is really connected with the prima facie explications and those 3 features that I mentioned. One example of the criticism of concepts in the logical sense can be found in the second paper by Margolis and Lawrence, published in 2007, of the ontology of concepts. I won't be giving you the full argument here, but let me just say briefly that they distinguish 3 meanings of the word concept, or 3 theories or approaches to concept. Psychological, I've already defined that earlier. Semantic, when they say that concepts are abstract objects, so they took this 4th constraint in Frege as relevant for the understanding of the concept, and they say that there is a mixed view available. This is also in perfect accordance with Frege, that concepts are mental representations typed in terms of the senses they express, right? And what they are trying to do, they are trying to provide argument against second and third use of concept. Really. So they want really to eliminate concepts in this logical sense and say that it is sufficient to speak really about psychological concepts. This is the aim they have. So the argument goes along those lines. So they are saying that concepts are not explanatory useful, and they are, among other things, saying that they are not good at addressing the so-called mode of presentation problem. And what they are saying also here is that concepts in the psychological sense are explanatory useful, by which they mean that they can solve the mode of presentation problems. And they conclude with saying that concepts speak and replace concepts in the logical sense. They address the mode of presentation problems by analyzing mental representations in terms of reference, so-called mental orthography. So they think that concepts or mental representations are like words. They have shapes or similar things. But I won't go into details. And so let us say that they are right in possibly saying that mental representation can play the role usual for concepts in the logical sense. I have 2 problems with this argument. One is that I think that Lawrence and Margolis, they presuppose here really that concepts in psychological sense are either observable entities or illata. I won't be giving you now the justification, but I think when they are trying to ascribe properties like mental orthography to concepts, they are really not treating them in a reductive way that was described previously. And the second problem which I have with this argument is that I don't think that solving the mode of presentation problem is the only explanatory role that can be given to concepts in the logical sense. I think that many intentional explanations, if we agree that there are good kinds of explanations, can refer to the concepts in the logical sense, but I will leave the justification of the claim for the discussion. So what I would like to finish that is with this quotation from George Piller. I really believe that philosophy as a conceptual analysis in the sense just sketched is autonomous. And as such, it might in many cases ignore what certain persons have to say in empirical science about concepts, because this might be philosophically irrelevant. Of course, I am not implying here that it is always the case. Okay, so that's all what I wanted to say. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, we have time for a question that can be asked and answered in 2 minutes. I'll try to be very brief. Conception is a word that people have used for what sounds like concept P, a psychological entity, in which case we can have that and also concepts which are closer to being senses. And I just want to ask you about a speculation that might help. Arguably, if a conception is a psychological entity, then an instance of it can figure in a causal explanation. A concept can figure in explaining what as opposed to explaining why. So a concept does explanatory work as a sort of abstract entity in an analysis, and a conception does explanatory work in the actual sequence of behavior. Is that a possible explanation that gets us through some of the controversy?
I agree with you, but my point is slightly stronger, so to speak, because I want to say that concepts in the logical sense are also good for the explanation of the first kind here.
With intentionality.
Yes.
Where we individuate the intentional attitudes like desires and beliefs.
In terms of content.
In a way, we do senses. Is that the idea?
The idea is that if intentional explanation refers to beliefs that are individuated in terms of content, and the content could be about concepts in the logical sense, sometimes at least, then this is a good way of explaining in intentional terms actions or behaviors. What really happens when we are speaking about the history of science in many cases? Concepts in the logical sense are important for, I don't know, certain theoretical changes that took place in time, for example. So that's my point in general. So, yes.
Okay, one more.
I'm not sure if I followed your claim of mental orthography in Lawrence and Margolis, but usually I think you might hear discussions about vehicles and mode and formats of representation in psychology, so say the imaginary debate. In such cases, when you talk about vehicles or those formats, I think it would be quite impossible to have concepts as abstracts, that they would have to be local, then they would be only on this other end of the spectrum. But I'm not sure if you criticize Lawrence and Margolis by just forgetting about the abstracta, or that's more the question about what was your point?
Yeah, my general point, which I'm still thinking about really, is that if you are introducing concepts like mental orthography, and you really want to say that mental representations have forms or shapes, right, in terms of which they are distinguished, and you are introducing certain internal property to mental representations that is totally independent of causal role and other properties. And that would result in making the mental representations illata, right? And this is the idea I don't like, because I don't think that mental representations are illata. But they might claim, of course, that they are. But I still see no reasons why we should think about them as illata, not as abstract. So that's my point in general. So that's all.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.